questions. Carrie took our allotted time tonight. No. At our last planning committee meeting, we've had a long interest in partnering with UIC in some capacity, and various topics came to mind, but I ran into Ryan at the Nashville Acoustic Society meeting in December, saw the name tag, oh, local UIC, great, let's make something happen, and thank you for accepting that offer and speaking tonight. Yeah, he has most of his credentials here on the slide. I don't need to read them. You probably read the meeting abstract, but I do want to at least highlight that Ryan is a hearing aid user for most of his life. He studies audio and acoustic signal processing to improve the performance of assistive and augmentative hearing technology, especially in noisy environments. His research emphasizes spatial signal processing, including microphone arrays, distributed sensor networks, and wireless audio systems. And that's just paragraph 1 of 2. He's very accomplished. But I'm going to turn it over to him. Ryan, take it away.
All right, thank you so much, Brandon. It's a pleasure to be here. This is my first AES Chicago event, so it's such a pleasure to meet you all and be here at Shore headquarters. So I'm Ryan. I'm a new faculty member at the University of Illinois, Chicago. I'm also with the Discovery Partners Institute, which is a new innovation hub here in Chicago dedicated to equitable economic development. And today I'm going to tell you a little bit about my research on hearing augmentation and signal processing for listening technology. So we all know how important hearing is in our daily lives. Sound is how we remain aware of our environments, how we enjoy media and entertainment, and most importantly, how we communicate with one another. But hearing is not always easy or accessible. We live in a noisy world, and it can be hard to communicate at crowded events like a big conference, a coffee break, or in a crowded restaurant. And that's especially true for people with hearing loss. I know because I'm one of them. I've worn hearing aids for most of my life, and I've always been frustrated by how poorly they work in the noisy environments where I need help the most. And so most of my research focuses on ways to improve hearing technology, but not just for people with hearing loss. Next generation listening technology could really enhance how everyone hears in a variety of situations. And it's an exciting time to be working in this field. It's rapidly changing and evolving, even just in the last few months. So there are traditional hearing aids, of course, but there are also these emerging categories of hearables. These are consumer-facing products that have hearing enhancement features, like the AirPods. And then going down the spectrum, you have augmented and virtual reality devices that are also enhancing and modifying how people hear. I know the AES has a whole workshop on AR and VR audio. I attended one in VR in 2020. That was kind of fun. So those are the devices that you wear on your ears. There's also a whole category of devices that maybe don't get quite as much attention, but are also important in enhancing hearing. And those are wireless listening systems, like remote microphone accessories for hearing aids and wireless broadcast systems that are found in performance venues. I would also include in the sensory augmentation category conferencing systems like the one we're using right now. Those of you who are online can hear me from, potentially hundreds of miles away, which is something your unaided ears cannot do. And later in the talk, I will explain how conferencing systems and other audio infrastructure could play a big role in the future of listening technology. But let me start with the more conventional categories of assistive listening systems. This is the most mature and developed part of the market. And there are a lot of different ways to think about hearing technology. There are websites whose whole role is just to track which company owns who else and all the various mergers and acquisitions. But I like to look at it on these two axes of how much hearing loss the user has and also situational versus more general use devices. So you have traditional hearing aids. These are medical devices that are regulated by the FDA. They're prescribed by a hearing health professional, and they're designed to be used all day in nearly all situations. So you'll wear them for several hours. They have a long battery life. They're non-occluding and comfortable to wear. For people with more severe hearing loss or who are deaf, they will get cochlear implants, which have a lot of the same front-end processing, but interface directly with the nervous system rather than acoustically with the eardrum. But there are these other categories of devices that are more situational. So I mentioned hearables earlier, and prior to last year, if you looked at the marketing materials for these, they're all non-medical devices. They're not FDA regulated. And so they all explain their benefits as for people with normal hearing, but who just need some extra help in certain situations. And that's true. They are more situational. They typically have shorter battery life. They tend to be occluding, meaning they fully seal the ear canal. That means they can do things like noise cancellation that hearing aids can't do. But you don't want to wear them all day. And then as of about a year ago, there's this new category of over-the-counter hearing aids. The FDA finalized these regulations in August of 2020. So there's all these new companies offering hearing aids over the counter. And these are supposed to be for only mild hearing loss, although they could apply to moderate as well. I also mentioned these wireless accessories. So these don't get as much attention, but they're quite important. So if you have hearing aids from one of the major companies, they will also offer accessories that will stream sound to the hearing aids. So with my hearing aids, I can get a remote microphone. I can clip it onto someone who's sitting across from me. It'll stream the sound right to my hearing aids. These are most widely seen in classrooms, where they're required accommodations under the Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act. They're also available for adults, but not quite as popular. Some of you who have worked on live sound might have seen assistive listening broadcast systems. So these will take whatever sound is being played over the speakers and transmit it to a headset or directly to the hearing aids in the case of an induction loop. Probably the most popular wireless assistive product is a TV streamer. Most people getting hearing aids for the first time are doing it because they have trouble hearing the TV or they're fighting with their spouse about how loud the TV is. So these are actually really popular. Audiologists sell a lot of them. You plug them into the TV and they stream right to the hearing aids. There are similar products for phones. But there are a lot of shortcomings in assistive technology today. By far, the biggest complaint is cost. Conventional hearing aids tend to cost thousands of dollars, and they are often not covered by insurance. Here in Illinois, private insurance has to cover part of the cost of hearing aids now, as of fairly recently, but Medicare does not cover hearing aids. That's the big one. These accessories I mentioned are also quite expensive because they tend to be proprietary. So if you have brand X of hearing aids, you have to get brand X remote microphone, and they can cost sometimes over $1,000. There are also performance issues. As I mentioned, hearing technology tends to fail in very noisy environments like crowded restaurants. Sometimes if I'm out at a bar and it's especially noisy, I hear better if I take my hearing aids out, which is not good. I think a big pain point in particular is group conversations, because a lot of the research and testing is done on intelligibility of one other talker in background noise. And those are not the situations most people need help with. It's when you're trying to mingle at a more complex social event. There are also performance issues with these wireless assistive listening systems. And it's not to say that all the technology is bad. There are some really good ones out there. But often you'll find systems that are only there to meet the minimum ADA requirements. So when I go out to certain of the theaters in downtown Chicago, I don't even bother checking out the headsets because they're worse than not using anything So there's a lot of room for improvement there as well. But there are some promising trends. The big news in the listening technology world, of course, is these new over-the-counter regulations. So within the past year, there have been a ton of new startups. They're experimenting with new business models where instead of going to an audiologist and paying a flat price for all of the technology and services, there are a la carte models, there are subscription models where they'll send you new hearing aids every so many years. There are direct-to-consumer models where it just comes out of the box as is, or you fit it yourself with an app, or there's more of a telehealth model. So there's a lot of experimentation. I'm hoping we'll see more market segmentation, so high-tech, more feature-rich hearing aids for young people like myself, maybe more simple things for people who don't want to bother with pushing buttons or dealing with technology. On the research and development side, a lot of the interest right now is in artificial intelligence. So I think one of the most useful AI features that's in most hearing aids now is automatic scene detection. So my hearing aids will sense when I'm at home in the living room, or I'm on a bus, or in a restaurant, or at work, and they'll change settings accordingly. There's also a lot of research going into AI-based noise reduction, which is pretty good at reducing certain types of noise, less good with others. I'll have more to say about that later. But I think the most exciting trend and what will drive a lot of the innovation going forward is greater connectivity. So just like in professional audio, there's a lot of interest in networked audio systems. In the hearing aid world, the big news is this new Bluetooth low energy audio standard. So this was developed at the request of the hearing aid industry. They went to the Bluetooth people and wanted to improve the Bluetooth standard so it would consume less power so that hearing aids could implement it directly, whereas today they generally need a third device to act as an intermediary. So these products are just starting to hit the shelves now. There were a lot of delays with the pandemic. But once it's all implemented, the hope is that hearing aids, consumer earbuds, consumer electronics will all be able to communicate on a common protocol. And that should greatly expand access. I think it will lead to a lot more innovation in features. One new feature that they've branded Auracast is a broadcast feature where you can connect your hearing device to, say, a TV at the gym or an audio description channel at the movie theater, and any number of devices can connect to it. So the Bluetooth organization expects this to replace assistive listening systems like induction loops and broadcast systems. And I don't know if it will. But I am hopeful that it will lead to assistive listening in more places that don't have it now. So if you go to the airport or the coffee shop, they don't have to install a full-fledged assistive listening system, but if they already have a Bluetooth sound system and they just need to push a button, then they can do that and allow people to connect. I'm also hoping that this new standard will lead to third-party accessories so that any hearing aid can be used with any microphone, any broadcast system. So the overall trend here is a convergence between medical hearing devices, consumer electronics, professional audio systems, increasingly blurry lines, greater intercompatibility, and that's going to lead to a lot more features and push innovation potentially into more superhuman hearing applications. And that's where we get into the realm of audio augmented reality. And when talking about AR, usually most of the attention is on vision. So if you have goggles, then you can kind of add images to the field of vision. But there are audio applications as well. Gaming is, of course, front and center in everyone's mind. The tech industry is very interested in conferencing applications and remote presence. So if you're collaborating with someone from a distance, can we make it sound like you're in the room with them, sharing the same space? There's immersive media production that makes you feel like you're in the room. I think probably the first widespread adoption of AR, other than hearing enhancement will be in industrial applications where you can make it easier to communicate. You can add kind of critical information cues in a more controlled environment. There's also a lot of investment, or at least research attention from the defense, intelligence, and public safety communities. So if you have first responders or soldiers who are in a very chaotic situation where there's a lot of noise, there's a lot of things they need to pay attention to, you want to enhance their ability to remain aware of their surroundings, but protect their hearing and still allow them to communicate. So there's a lot of interest there as well. So now let me pivot and talk a bit about the technology that goes into building a listening system. What will it take to build better hearing aids, to build these superhuman augmented hearing systems? We can do better today than just a horn or a funnel. So let me start with kind of general principles of sensory augmentation. It's an interesting field to work in because it lies at the intersection of artificial intelligence and human intelligence. In a lot of signal processing work and a lot of AI work, we're trying to imitate what humans do. So speech recognition, image recognition, you're trying to do what humans do with a machine. But in sensory augmentation, we're trying to get the machine and the human to work together. So it's a different problem. You want to add to what humans are already able to do. There's a few different categories, which I'll explain by analogy to vision. So there's correction, like glasses or contact lenses, which just change the sense a little bit, make it work normally. That's how people would like hearing aids to work. It's a little harder than that in practice. But we can also do enhancement, let humans perceive things that their normal sense organs wouldn't be powerful enough to do. So a telescope has these big lenses that let us see farther than our eyes normally could. Microscopes let us see smaller things. The image on the right is my back door in my new Chicago apartment last winter when it was very cold and there was a draft. So I went down to the hardware store and rented this camera, the infrared camera, to let me find where the draft is. So this is an example of adding new capabilities that humans didn't have before. I can't see temperature, but with this device I can, and I can interact with the world in a different way. So an important thing to notice is that for correction, it's okay to have a device that's no bigger than kind of the unaided sense organ. The contact lens will fit in your eye. You can leave it there all day. It's fairly invisible. Again, like people would like hearing aids to work. But if we want to be more ambitious, if we want superhuman perception, we need more hardware. We need our system to have capabilities that unaided humans don't have, to have information they don't have access to. And that's a general principle in designing these sensory augmentation systems. We need to be able to get information humans don't have. And for hearing, I think that means more ears. Having microphone arrays that can capture sound with higher spatial resolution, or having microphones spread around a space will give us access to more information than just our two ears can get on their own. In a sensory enhancement application, we also have to make that information useful to humans. And that's a big difference from say a speech recognition application where you're just trying to get information out of the computer. We want to work with the senses humans already have. So the infrared camera is mapping temperature onto something I can perceive, which color. And in the case of listening systems, we want to be careful to preserve spatial information, to preserve timing information that the brain relies on, but that might not be useful in other applications, and that will add more constraints. I'll say more about that in a moment. And kind of the corollary of these two, if we have a system with greater capabilities than humans, but we're trying to map it onto human senses, there's inherently going to be a trade-off. We need to lose some information along the way. In the case of a telescope, we can make the night sky appear much closer, but only a small slice of it at a time. And similarly with hearing, we'll often find there's a trade-off between enhancement and immersion. So those of you listening to me here now, if you were wearing hearing aids or if you have your AirPods in hear-through mode, that's very immersive. You're just kind of hearing an amplified version of what's in the room. Those of you hearing me remotely are hearing me through headphones or speakers. You have no sense of immersion in the room, but you normally couldn't hear me from this far away. So that's an example of extreme enhancement. And when we're building systems, we want to be somewhere in between. So what would be the hearing equivalent of a telescope or a microscope or this fancy camera? Well, I think it would look something like a mixing board. This is the AES. We all know mixing boards. You have a separate slider for each sound, so you can adjust the different instruments, the dialogue, the sound effects to achieve a certain artistic intent and a certain listening experience to provide intelligibility, but also ambiance. What if we could do the same thing for real life? If hearing aids and other listening devices could manipulate the sounds around us in real time and let us customize the listening experience. So if you walk into a restaurant, your device could turn up the voices of the other people at your table, turn down the voices of people at other tables, maybe completely get rid of the ventilation system and the clanking plates in the kitchen. But we want to do all this in real time, and we want to do it in an immersive way. So it doesn't sound like you're listening to a recording. It feels like you're in the space with the other sound sources, and you can navigate that. So that's where these extra perceptual constraints come in that we don't face in a lot of other signal processing applications. So delay is a big one. When I'm listening with my hearing aids in, I'm actually hearing the same sound twice. Once directly into my ear canal through the air, and a second time processed through the hearing aid. And if there's too much delay between those two sounds, then there can be comb filtering distortion or even audible echoes. It's especially difficult for speech production if you hear your own voice echoed back. Which I was experiencing here at the beginning of the talk. Thank you for adjusting the sound. And this delay constraint is pretty strict. The usual rule of thumb in hearing aid design is about 10 milliseconds. Now that's kind of a fuzzy number. It depends on whether it's occluding or not occluding, whether it's your own voice or someone else's, and the degree of hearing loss and amplification. But it's roughly on that order of magnitude. And notably, that's a lot shorter than you typically get with Bluetooth or other digital wireless systems. It's also shorter than the processing time we generally want for machine learning applications that are taking advantage of sparsity or looking at context to improve performance. We also care about spatial cues. When I'm in the room with someone, I don't want it to sound like I'm talking on the phone with them. I want to get the room acoustics. I want to get the spatial cues. So there are a couple key spatial cues that humans use to localize sound. There's interaural level difference, interaural time difference for sounds coming from the left versus the right. There are head-related transfer functions. These are shaping effects from the outer ear that help us to tell front from back and up and down. And depending on the application, we may or may not want to preserve the room acoustics. So in some settings, we might want to keep early reflections that give us a sense of the kind of scale of the room, but maybe get rid of the late reverberation that impacts intelligibility. So we want our system to preserve this for listeners so that the brain can do its own natural source separation and our algorithms don't have to work as hard. The more you can offload to the brain, the more transparent the experience will be, and the smoother the whole process will go. Now, to do this remixing, we have to be able to separate the sounds in real time. Generally, in a studio, you'll have separate recordings of each source, or you'll have separate microphones on each sound. And in real life, that's rarely the case. So we need some principle of separating the sounds, telling what the listener wants to hear and what they don't want to hear. And there are a few different ways we can separate sounds. The most common is by type of sound. So video conferencing software has gotten pretty good at this lately. If I'm on a Zoom call, I can, run the tea kettle or have animals running around, and Zoom will be very good at filtering that out. It's less good for other human speech, like if I'm in a coffee shop. For that, we want to filter by spatial area. So I might want to only hear sounds that are in front of me, or only people who are around my table in the cafeteria. And we can do that using beamforming, for example, from a microphone array, or directional microphones. If we want really complete control over the listening experience, then we want to separate sounds down to individual sources, individual talkers or objects in the room that are making sound. And that's the most difficult to achieve unless you can place the microphones directly on everything. So for separating different types of sounds, it's pretty good, easy to do that using machine learning. So machine learning techniques use some kind of decomposition on the signal, either like the short-time Fourier transform or a learned transform. Became especially important during the pandemic when everyone had face masks and was standing far apart. But I think we're still waiting to find the really compelling application there. All right, are we back online? Great. So I was talking about source separation. So machine learning is, of course, the hot topic in every field these days. And that's where the bulk of source separation research is being done. And learning-based methods are very good at separating dissimilar signals. You can get really cool results breaking a music recording apart into different instruments. It's also pretty easy to separate speech from non-speech, like animal sounds, mechanical noise. It's harder to separate speech from other speech, and that's what we encounter in a lot of challenging listening environments. That's not to say it can't be done. There's a lot of research demonstrations on separating 2 or 3 talkers in a fairly controlled environment, but it's hard to scale those learning-based algorithms to really complex dynamic scenes where people are moving around, interrupting each other, and that's the kind of places where we want to help people here. You can also ask the philosophical question of, if we're trying to achieve superhuman hearing, humans already have really good neural networks built in that we've trained for many years with lots of training data. Will learning-based techniques ever be able to beat that, and beat it by a lot? There are definitely learning-based noise reduction systems that can improve comfort, that can reduce fatigue, that can, slightly improve intelligibility. But for a really dramatic night and day difference, we need information that humans don't already have, that our built-in neural networks can't get access to. And that's where spatial processing comes in. So I imagine most of you are familiar with microphone arrays. There's some in this room right now, so I don't really need part of this slide. Microphone arrays are sets of microphones that are set apart from each other in space, so that sound coming from different directions will reach different microphones at different times. And based on that, you can isolate sounds coming from a particular direction, reduce noise from different directions. So arrays are widely used these days in smart speakers, in laptops, in conferencing equipment. So these tiles in the ceiling have, I think, 100-some microphones that are steering beams throughout the room. Beamformers can also be used to enhance hearing, but there is a catch, and that is spatial cues. So if you've ever listened through a beamformer, a beamforming-based listening device, it sounds kind of like being in a tunnel. Everything sounds like it's coming from the direction of where the beam is pointing, and that's a consequence of the math of the optimization problem that beamforming solves, that it collapses all the spatial cues to one direction. And this is pretty well understood mathematically. We know how to get around it. You can add extra constraints to your optimization problem that basically trade off some of the noise reduction for better preserving those spatial cues. And what that means is that if you want a given level of performance while remaining immersive, you need more microphones. You need more degrees of freedom in your optimization problem, which means a pair of microphones in an earpiece is not enough. You really want a larger microphone array. And large microphone arrays are not a new idea. People have been proposing wearable microphone arrays with big sets of microphones for many years now, several decades. And by far the most popular form factor I've seen is glasses. If I check Kickstarter on any given day, there's usually someone proposing microphone array glasses, but they've never been commercially successful yet. Not just Kickstarter, also some very big tech companies. So a few years ago, I decided to look at wearable array design to figure out where should we actually put these microphones. Are glasses a good choice? Are helmets? That's another popular one. Where should they go? So my students and I put together this data set where we measured acoustic impulse responses all over the body on different wearable accessories, and we compared different beamformer designs. We implemented some of them in hardware. You can see the giant hat there, which has a nice big aperture compared to just the head. Vest is actually a really good design because the torso has a strong acoustic shadowing effect at high frequencies. So you get a lot more spatial diversity for the same number of microphones. So I think if you're going to build a wearable array, go with the vest. And if you'd like to play around with this data, try your own designs. It's available for free on our website. There is a problem with wearable arrays, though. If you're putting microphones all over the body, it might work pretty well on a mannequin, but when it's on a real human, those microphones will be moving relative to each other. So that's called a deformable microphone array. And it's a pretty unique problem because in a ceiling tile or in a smart speaker, the array is rigid. All the microphones have the same geometry. The sources might move, but your microphones don't. And when the array geometry changes, that dramatically changes the properties of the beamformer. So over the last few years, we've been looking at ways to make beamformers more robust against motion. And it's a difficult problem. So this demo is a first attempt at it in a highly controlled environment. So I have a wearable microphone array here with 11 microphones, and I'll be moving around in a very predictable pattern that we can model statistically in order to separate these sound sources. So in this demo, you'll first hear the 5 sound sources mixed together, and then the separated results while the microphones are moving. Hang on, this is turned down. Start that over.
We are not aware of any British casualty. It isn't the seriousness of it. It is about control of our economy. There was a rush of water.
The rainbow is a division of white light into many beautiful colours. These take the shape of a long round arch with its pass at a bump and its 2 ends apparently beyond.
So that is the mic arena. So as I said, it's a pretty contrived example. It's hard to do this in a more unconstrained way. We're working on it using more sophisticated tracking techniques like manifold learning. But that's one of many reasons that large wearable arrays aren't very practical, even if they are extremely fashionable, like the giant hat. If we want a really reliable way to separate and remix sound sources, there's no substitute for just putting a microphone on the thing you want to hear. And I've already mentioned these wireless microphone devices that are available for hearing systems. And they are really quite remarkable. If you look at the clinical audiology literature about algorithmic noise reduction, learning-based noise reduction, it's a very good result if you can get a statistically significant improvement in intelligibility. But if you have a microphone on the person across the room, you're going to get just a night and day difference in intelligibility. So it's unfortunate that these things aren't more widely used. You really only find them in classrooms where they're legally required. And there are a lot of kind of practical barriers to using them. You have to charge an extra device, carry it around, explain to people how to use it. You have to self-identify and ask for an accommodation. But there's also some technical limitations. They generally only work with one talker at a time. There are a few array-based devices that will work with multiple people, but they have to take turns. And if you've ever been out to eat with my family, you know that's not how it works. So if we want to really get reliable superhuman hearing, I think wireless microphones are the way to do it, but we need to improve them and make them more usable and accessible. And these new advances in connectivity, especially digital wireless standards, might make that possible. So what would a better remote microphone system look like? Well, we want to be able to use more than one at once to help with these very challenging group conversations in uncontrolled environments. And we want to preserve spatial cues, especially with multiple people. You want to be able to tell who said what and have that sense of immersion even as you're moving around, turning to face people in the conversation. So here's a system we proposed a few years ago that combines several remote microphones as well as the microphones on the earpieces. And these use actually just a normal adaptive filtering algorithm like LMS to try to match the low noise remote microphone signal to the noisy signal at the earpieces, which have the correct spatial cues because they're right on the ears. So it sounds like listening through your own ears, just with less noise. And we can show that this will converge correctly if the microphones are well positioned so that the noise meets certain properties. So this looks a lot like an echo cancellation system or an active noise control system, just with some of the inputs and outputs rearranged. And I'll show a demo of this for a group conversation situation. The scenario here is you have 3 people seated around a table and they all have a listening device, whether that's hearing aids or earbuds. And they have either a nice lapel microphone like this one, or just a smartphone sitting on the table. Tons of people eat dinner with their phones on the table. Why not use them to make it easier to hear? So in this demo, you'll be hearing through the ears of one of my students. This is a binaural demo. Those of you listening at home with headphones should be able to hear the spatial cues pretty clearly. Those of you in the room, they'll still come across over the speakers, but you can find this on my website later if you'd like to listen with headphones. And then the other 2 of us will be talking while there's some speakers in the background. So first you'll hear the unprocessed sound, then the proposed system using a phone, and finally using the high quality lapel mic.
It can be hard to follow group conversations in loud background noise, like at a restaurant.
The listener has to keep track of multiple people talking at the same time.
And they sometimes interrupt each other.
A single hearing device can't do much to help on its own.
But we can connect several devices together to enhance speech from the group and get rid of background noise.
The system reproduces spatial cues so that it sounds like hearing through your own ears,
even when multiple people talk at once. An adaptive filter updates the spatial cues as the listener moves their head,
which makes it easier to follow the group conversation.
So the hardest part of running this demo was convincing my student to talk over me. He's very polite, I promise. So the really cool thing about this technique is it relies entirely on appropriate placement of the microphones. The microphones behind the ears give you the spatial cues. The microphones on the talker give you the signal-to-noise ratio. There's no source separation. There's no beam forming, no localization, no simulating spatial cues. It all comes from the geometry and can give really powerful results if we can place those microphones appropriately. And we can generalize this system if we had more microphones in the room that could capture those background sources, if we had microphones spread all over a larger environment, then that's how we could achieve really superhuman hearing. And a few years ago when I would give talks like this, I'd talk about, well, you know, if you had a room covered in microphones, wouldn't that be great? But nowadays we usually do. There are so many microphones just in everything. Wearables, IoT devices, smart home devices, and conferencing infrastructure, and they're all connected to networks. So if we could tap into those microphones that are always all around us, that's how we could really push past the capabilities of a single device and reach superhuman levels of hearing enhancement. So I think what will drive hearing technology forward over the next few years is this greater connectivity, greater compatibility between medical devices, consumer devices, so that it can work with other devices that have more power and more information than the hearing device on its own. And this already exists with these assistive listening systems and remote microphones. They can be improved and expanded. You saw in that last demo that we can use personal electronics, and these are great because they're attached to the people who are talking and move as they move, so we don't have that problem with motion. Their wearables are a great way to get close to the source. I think another important component will be infrastructure, like these ceiling tiles here in this room, that can be permanently installed in a space, calibrated to the space, and attached to a lot more computational power. So this is a picture of one of the conference rooms at DPI. It's about the size of the room we're in now, and it also has these Shure ceiling tiles. And the purpose of them is to facilitate hybrid meetings and hybrid learning. And so these powerful conferencing systems really took off during the pandemic. I know in Champaign, our local school district installed some of these as well. And they do a great job of isolating the voice of someone who's talking. They don't need to clip on another microphone. They just stand up and talk. So it makes it a lot more pleasant on the remote participants. What it doesn't help with is someone who's sitting in the other side of the room. So in this particular conference room at DPI, I'm not sure why, but the acoustics are terrible, and I can never hear someone who's just a few feet away. But if we could tap into this in-room system to also help people who are in the room, then it would make the space a lot more accessible. And this is a pretty simple setup. You could do it today with off-the-shelf components. Get one of those assistive listening broadcast systems and plug it into your mixer. But it's cumbersome. It's hard to use. So my hope is that over the next few years, companies who are making these systems and installing them will build in accessibility by default, and hearing devices will be able to connect with them so that I can just walk into a room and have that extra help wherever I need it. Things get more fun if you have multiple of these devices installed in a room. If you have arrays spread around a room, you can combine them to do more aggressive noise reduction and other types of processing. So here's a paper that we're working on that should hopefully be coming soon on combining the outputs of multiple beamformers in a way that isolates sound around one table, gets rid of sound around other tables, so everyone can have a private conversation in their own sound zone. And in this application, everything's hardwired together, so the processing isn't too difficult. But where things really get fun is if you want to combine different kinds of devices. If you have hardwired devices in the room, mobile devices, wearables, and you want to connect them all together, then there are a lot more signal processing challenges. So remember, hearing devices have to have very low latency. So wireless networks are often too slow to provide information in real time when it's needed. We might not know the locations of all the devices, especially mobile and wearable devices, and they might move relative to each other. They also might not be perfectly synchronized. Sample clocks within audio devices tend to vary by a couple parts per million, and most of the time we can just ignore that. But if we're trying to do phase coherent processing like beamforming or localization, those offsets become important. So we might not be able to do traditional phase coherent signal processing with all these distributed devices. But we can still make use of the information. For example, magnitude features are a lot more robust against motion and sample rate offsets compared to phase. And we can divide processing tasks according to different scales of computational complexity, time constraints, and space. So you could have a listening device that's doing real-time processing to generate its output within 10 milliseconds, and it can only take a direct audio input from its own microphones, or maybe a very fast analog microphone, wireless microphone. But it can work with other devices to do parameter estimation, to figure out who's talking when, to track where the sources are in the room, what kind of sound they are, and to set some of these mixing levels. Potentially some of that could be done by more powerful computers in the room or even in the cloud. So I'll show just a couple examples, and then that will be the end. So here's an experiment we did several years ago. Actually, Matt, who's in here, helped set this up. So we went to the biggest conference room in our building, big glass-walled room, and just filled it with microphone arrays. We have a total of 160 microphones, and we're trying to do separation of 10 sources at once. Very reverberant room, so it's a very hard challenge, even with all these microphones. And the extra constraint here is the listening devices, these wearable microphone arrays, can't use any other microphones in the room for real-time processing, only for parameter estimation. So we use the entire array to figure out where the sources are in the room and characterize the acoustics, but then only the wearable devices themselves do the beamforming. So in this video, you'll hear first the clean source then the mixture, and then the processed sound. And you'll be listening through the ears of this mannequin on the right.
7 years as a journalist. We must provide a long-term solution to tackle this attitude. Then suddenly, they weren't.
So that's pretty cool, given just the sheer number of sources in the room and the terrible acoustics, that it's able to calibrate that well. We are kind of cheating here because nothing's moving. It's all mannequins and speaker stands. So for this last demo, I'll show you some real humans moving in and talking live. So in this case, it's the opposite problem. We have a microphone array that's trying to capture this conversation, but it doesn't know exactly where the talkers are. And if there's reverberation in the room, if there's noise sources moving around, then you don't want to have just a directional beamformer. You want to calibrate it to the acoustics as much as possible. We also have wearable devices, earbuds on each of the talkers, and they're not synchronized with the array, so we can't use them directly for beamforming. And they have pretty poor signal-to-noise ratios because there's noise behind them, but they're very good at telling who's talking when, and telling us when the wearer is talking. And so we'll use those to calibrate this fixed microphone array, which can then do its processing in real time with as low latency as you'd like. And even if there's a delay and synchronization issues, it can still learn these parameters based on magnitude features. So this will be the same setup as before with my two students, but this time we'll all be talking at once, and you'll hear the unprocessed sound and then separated sound by this array using the wearables to help.
A king ruled the state in the early days. The ship was drawn apart from the sharp peak.
He ran halfway to the hardware store.
The wide road shimmered in the hot sun.
The beauty of the view stunned the young boy.
So this and the other demos are great examples of what you can do when you combine multiple devices and use their strengths and weaknesses to complement each other. You can get more performance, more robustness in real-world environments than you could get with any device alone. So my hope is that sometime in the future, we'll have just microphones everywhere. So I can walk into a noisy cafeteria, and my hearing aids will connect to the hearing aids and smart earbuds and AR headsets of everyone else in the room, everyone I'm talking to. They'll connect to built-in infrastructure that's been calibrated to the space and has powerful computation to track anything. They'll use AI to decide what I want to hear or need to hear, adjust the levels of all the sounds based on my individual hearing profile, and present it back to me in an immersive way so that I don't even notice I'm listening through a device. It just sounds like I'm in this real space and able to hear comfortably. And the technology may never be quite that seamless, but I think if we want to push hearing technology to superhuman levels, if we want to radically transform the way that humans experience the world through sound, we need to think beyond earpieces and headsets and really embrace connectivity. So thank you so much. If you'd like to learn more, you can visit my website, which will still take you to Urbana. My new UIC page will be ready soon. You can also find me on LinkedIn, YouTube, and Twitter at Ryan M. Corey. And I'd be delighted to take questions and meet all of you. I'm excited to connect with other Chicago audio folks. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Ryan. Questions? Yes.
I've got an appointment with my audiologist next week, so you give me a lot of questions to ask him. I need hearing aids as much for tinnitus suppression, and I was wondering if you could talk about that a little bit and why the sounds, which is a birds chirping, why is that used or whatever? Any insight you got into that?
Yeah, so tinnitus is a really tough problem. The question was about tinnitus or tinnitus, flip a coin, how you like to pronounce it. And that's ringing in the ears. It's something that often accompanies hearing loss. And the bad news is we don't really know what to do about it technologically. It's internal to the ears. So a lot of hearing aids will have features that will play white noise or other noise to try to mask it and make it more comfortable. But as far as correcting it, that's still an open research problem.
So you bring up tinnitus. I've had tinnitus for about since 1997. I just tune it out. I've learned, but that's beside the point. Personal experience. First of all, I've been wearing hearing aids for about 6 or 7 years. Understanding you has been the best I've had in about 5 years. I don't know how the acoustics are in here, but it's fantastic. I've got 100% intelligibility. But one advantage of the single, mic, I've got one of the what Resound calls the multi-mic. Mm-hmm. And my wife spends a lot of time on the computer in the living room. So I have the multi-mic right there by her. And I can hear her perfectly anywhere in the house, which makes her feel good. Of course, when she's not by the multi-mic, the intelligibility goes way down. And I'm seeing my audiologist in about a month, and I've got to talk to her about that because the conundrum is it sounds perfect on the multi-mic and not so perfect in the hearing aids.
Oh, that's an interesting insight. Yeah.
Now, my hearing loss goes to about 2,300 hertz, and it drops down, but within a couple hundred hertz, it drops down to 40, 50 dB down. You can't mirror that very well on the hearing aids.
Yeah, I'm surprised it's better than, just being up close. There must be different processing, but yeah, that just speaks to how powerful these wireless mics can be when they work well and when people use them. And if we just made them more attractive for people to use, then they could really have a big impact. So I hope to hear more stories like that in the future.
Yeah, very early on, you spoke about the source separation, not the multi-microphone, things like that, just the signal processing source separation. And just wondering, one of your points there was briefly touched on was the delay processing. In other words, the processing time to be able to do that. And it seems like you would need, I don't know, more than 10 milliseconds of sound in order to be able to decide what kind of sound it is. Could you just elaborate more on what kind of limitation is the processing time to real-time live source separation?
Yes, I think I actually skipped over talking about that bullet point when we had the issue with the screen. So thank you for reminding me of that. So it's kind of easiest to understand if you go to slightly older, like 2015, 2016 source separation methods based on time frequency masks. So if you take a short time Fourier transform, you can chop up the sound into individual pixels, put it back together. And that works best with window sizes of around 60 milliseconds for speech in speech, because that's where it's most sparse. Now, modern methods use more learned transforms. It's more end-to-end, so we don't have that same concept of window sizes, but you still want that frequency resolution from having a long window. You also want the context of, looking ahead and looking back a couple syllables to get the best speech separation performance. Now, a lot of people are working on machine learning architectures that can go much faster in under 10 milliseconds. There have been plenty of papers about that, but there's always a penalty, and you get worse performance than if you had that full context. And kind of the best case performance is that you have a full recording and you're looking at the whole thing at once.
Going back in time.
Yeah. We don't have that luxury when we're in the room.
We've got a question from the chat while we're passing the microphone here. Andrew Bellavia asks, Curious how you could use smartphones and get low enough latency in an MR environment like you showed.
Yes. So in this case, we were doing the processing offline. It was really recorded by smartphones, but we then processed it later. And you're right, they would be too slow to do that in real time. Latency is the problem that keeps me up at night. And the new Bluetooth standard is supposed to be better. We've gotten a few early development kits, and we can get it down to around 20 milliseconds, which is probably good enough for certain situations. But I would really love to have much better wireless standards. We could build so much more robust systems if we could get that even lower. We have done it in real time with analog microphones, though, and you can find those demos on my website as well.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Yeah, so like regarding latency, have you looked into like 5G, and do you think like 5G networks have potential for the future for these applications? Can you speak to that?
Yeah, 5G was advertised to have super low latency, so I'd definitely be interested to try that. I'm not aware of any, 5G microphones you can get off the shelf. Maybe they're out there. I have looked at Wi-Fi based systems, so there are Wi-Fi assistive listening systems, and at least the commercial ones you can get have pretty awful latency. But 5G might be an attractive solution. I'll have to think more on that.
All right. Any more questions? Any more? One more? The last chance, because I'm sure he won't talk to us after.
Oh, yes.
I'm sure he will. But thank you. Wow, that was amazing. I mean, it's not so much a question as I haven't needed to see an audiologist yet, but eventually I will. I think my wife might beat me to it, because in that conversation about the level of the TV, there's a certain dynamic. But this is very encouraging. I just feel like with what I'm hearing tonight, it's like I don't have to worry, because there are things that are going to kind of make this kind of an easy transition when it comes. I don't know. It's very hopeful from what I've heard. But anyway, thank you so much. This has been wonderful. I'm going to set this down, turn it off, and present you with the AES mug. All right, great.
Thank you so much. It's a really pleasure to be here.